Let me preface the rest of this video by saying that I enjoyed my time with Tears of the Kingdom. I finished the story in about 60 hours, and overall I had a lot of fun with it. My opinion of the game is actually more positive than negative. I think it's an artistic and technical achievement for Nintendo, especially when you consider the context of its release on the aging 10-year-old hardware that is the Nintendo Switch. I think its open world remains engaging, and I think the puzzles and physics engine encourage creativity and allow a freedom that few games can offer. But there are many negatives, much more so than with its predecessor. I found myself frustrated when playing, and by its conclusion I ended up rushing to the end of the story, just to get it out of the way. Further to this, as quickly as I'd rushed to finish the game, I just as quickly forgot about it, and since finishing, I hadn't given it another thought. Instead of doing a review, which would be coming much too late anyway, I wanted to make a video looking at why the game made me feel the way I did, and why its initial positive reception has become much more muted over time. I don't seem to be alone in my thoughts on this. There is a growing feeling within the Zelda community that Tears of the Kingdom was not as good as people were expecting, that it hasn't become people's favourite game of all time like many had predicted before release, and it hasn't lived up to the pre-release hype levels. At first glance, this doesn't make much sense. If you think about it logically, Tears of the Kingdom provides everything that Breath of the Wild did, and adds more in nearly every department. A bigger map, nearly 3 times as big, larger and more fleshed out dungeons, more characters, more dialogue with those characters, more cutscenes which are better animated and fully voice acted, and, arguably, a more coherent and planned out narrative. Nintendo had clearly paid attention to the reaction to Breath of the Wild, and the experimentation that it fostered following its release, with tons and tons of videos online of players doing all sorts of crazy things, breaking the game and pushing the engine to its limits. The abilities that Link is given in Tears of the Kingdom, and the sandbox that you're given to wander around in, means that there are potentially limitless combinations of outcomes and events that can happen. Tears of the Kingdom is the ultimate endpoint of the physics-based system that was originally presented in Breath of the Wild. This was all distilled down into something which can be shared on a 20-second TikTok video or YouTube short. I think this game was literally designed to be a viral hit. However, Nintendo and the development team behind Tears of the Kingdom were damned by their own success with Breath of the Wild. Whilst that game felt revolutionary, Tears of the Kingdom feels merely iterative. Whilst Breath of the Wild was a reinvention of the series, Tears of the Kingdom is just the next installment. The sense of wonder and discovery of exploring the Hyrule of Breath of the Wild was inevitably and unfortunately dulled when exploring the same space again. How a game is perceived and received by the public, by gamers, and by Zelda fans is not an entirely rational and scientific process. You can say that Tears of the Kingdom is a better game than Breath of the Wild, and you'd probably be right. But that doesn't encapsulate a feeling, a moment, a point in time. Breath of the Wild released at just the right time, at the start of the Switch's life cycle, when people needed something deep to explore and something to hold their attention, when so few games had released for the system. In some ways, looking back at it now, it feels a bit basic, a bit bare bones, but there's a certain charm to Breath of the Wild, which is fitting and matched the blank slate and the potential of the Switch in 2017. Nintendo's job with Tears of the Kingdom was to capture that magic again, to bottle it and release it in a sequel. And whilst Tears of the Kingdom was a success, both critically and commercially, it feels at once both cluttered and missing something. Which means instead of it being one of my favourite games of all time, it's just simply a game I enjoyed and finished. So join me now on a journey, whilst I go over all of the reasons that Tears of the Kingdom does not evoke the same emotion as Breath of the Wild. The most obvious starting point for comparison is in the open world, because this is where Tears of the Kingdom differentiates itself from Breath of the Wild the most, and it's what was emphasised the most in the marketing of the game leading up to release. The Sky Islands were going to fulfil the unkept promise of Skyward Sword, to see the original ambition for that game realised. Unfortunately, it's in the Sky Islands, and as we later found out in the depths, where Tears of the Kingdom falls down hardest, with a lack of compelling content and reasons to explore these new areas. Let's start with the Sky Islands. My first thought about the Sky Islands were largely positive. They seemed like a good playground to explore using Link's abilities. and I liked the initial island, the equivalent of the Great Plateau, which I thought was well designed and had a lot of thought put into it. I liked that they encouraged you to get experimental, not just whilst you were up there, but also in finding different ways to get back into the sky once you'd come down. And I enjoyed the one main dungeon that's in the sky. I found the puzzle element to reach it challenging, but not insurmountable, and as it was the first one I did, I think I was still riding that early enthusiasm. But once I had come down from that initial high, see what I did there, I found there were very few reasons to go back up, because as it turns out, the Sky Islands are repetitive. Once you've seen one, you've basically seen them all, with the exception of the dungeon and the mandated Sky Island, which is part of the main story. The only inhabitants are the Zonai robots, most of whom want to kill you, and the ones who don't really have much interesting to say. The activities in the Sky Islands can be boiled down to jumping through hoops, moving platforms around to use catapults, and moving sky platforms using Ultrahound. It's a shame because I think there was a real missed opportunity there. A real developed town in the sky would have been something really interesting. My thoughts on the depths. I had a bit of an oh shit moment when I first went into the depths. It was the same feeling I had when I went down into Siofra River in Elden Ring. I jumped down a hole and I just kept falling and falling and falling. And finally when I did land, I looked around and it was just total blackness. I opened my map and I saw that like the Sky Islands and like the ground level of Hyrule, there was a whole new map to discover. I thought to myself, they wouldn't make a map as big underground as above ground, would they? Well, as it turns out, they would and they wouldn't. The depths does mirror the surface in lots of ways, but when you actually start to explore further, you notice it again. A lack of real content or activities for you to take part in. It's a bit like the Starfield problem. You can have 1,000 planets, you can have 10,000 planets, but if there's nothing meaningful to do on those planets, or as in this case, in the cavern, what's the point? Ultimately with any of the zones in Tears of the Kingdom, and this kind of retroactively applies to Breath of the Wild as well. The question I found myself asking was, why? Why should I go and explore further in the depths? Why should I keep mapping out the deeps? What am I going to find that's interesting, or that changes the way that I play? It all comes down to rewards. What rewards are there for the player? In Tears of the Kingdom, the answer is either an armor piece, which were a lot of reused amiibo assets from Breath of the Wild, or a piece of a schematic for Ultrahound, or a few rupees, with nothing interesting to buy in the game, or a meal with some benefits, which clogs up your inventory. If I'm sounding a bit negative, it's because I feel that way, and this is my biggest problem with Tears of the Kingdom. Compare this to Elden Ring. Exploration in Elden Ring is rewarded through multiple means. You might find a new weapon, which completely changes your playstyle. You might find a spirit, which can help you in battle. Or you might find an interesting NPC, which starts you on a long quest chain. I appreciate that rewards in Zelda have always been this way. However, I think with an open world game, the expectation changes. In the old linear Zelda titles, the focus was much more on the dungeons and puzzles. In open world games, there needs to be more incentive to explore, and Tears of the Kingdom unfortunately doesn't provide that. Okay, let's take a minute to go over the abilities, which on the whole I think are a step up from the ones in Breath of the Wild, but I still have a few issues with their implementation. Ascend feels tailor-made to fit alongside Tears of the Kingdom's new focus on dungeons and going underground. Exploring a cave deeper and deeper, and having to think about backtracking out, is never a concern because you know you can always just ascend back through the roof. It changes how you view the map and the overworld, because instead of just looking for routes to paraglide into, you're also looking for overhangs and things above you that you can possibly ascend into. It changes the dynamics of gameplay in quite a large way, and I think Ascend was a very good ability. Fuse. For the longest time I kept forgetting about this ability, thinking that it was the same as Ultrahound and disregarding it. As you get to the tail end of the game, Fuse becomes more useful, as you need weapons that deal more damage, and the easiest way to achieve this is to fuse monster parts to your weapons, which means this ability would not be necessary if there was no weapon degradation in the game. The fun part of Fuse is mixing together different ingredients with your weapons to see what happens, but mostly this is with fusing things to arrows, like the example given in the initial trailer of a Kisai which follows enemies. You quickly find some favourites though, and so experimentation is only really for the early game. My problem with Fuse is its integration into the game. It's very clunky, especially mid-combat, requiring multiple button prompts. I think this is part of the reason why I didn't notice it for most of the game. Fusion with arrows is integrated more seamlessly than weapon fusion. When you go to take a shot, a little option comes up allowing you to attach something to that arrow, but even that's a little bit clunky. Rewind allows for some neat puzzles. That's about all I have to say about it really. Ultra Hand is obviously the star of the show, a free-form crafting system which allows you to piece together objects in the world to make creations. And it seems at first like you have complete creative freedom, only limited by your imagination. Obviously that's not the whole story, and there had to be a limit somewhere in the system, and that limit comes in the form of the Zonai devices. These are ultimately what you can fuse together to make your creations in Tears of the Kingdom, and in this respect you are somewhat limited by the devices that the developers put into the game. There are a good selection of devices which are trickled out over the course of the game, and all of them allow you to move through the world and solve different puzzles. It's been interesting to see what crazy creations people have come up with online, like transforming laser shooting mecha and ingenious flying devices. In some ways I love Ultra Hand and the freedom that it gives you to make all this crazy stuff. On the other hand, it can be quite cumbersome to maneuver and put together all the things that you want. You can have a design in mind in your head quite quickly, but then take 5 to 10 minutes awkwardly moving things into place. It doesn't help that whenever you use Ultra Hand, the game starts to chug and moves down to about 15 FPS. Quite often with the puzzles, you quickly realise what needs to be done, and that moment is satisfying. But then actually using Ultra Hand and doing the actions gets quickly frustrating. Later on in the game, they try to alleviate some of this by bringing in a recipe style system where you can make things that you've made in the past instantly, either if you have the materials to hand or by using a currency. The trouble with this is it only remembers the last certain few things that you've made before, and so it doesn't always help, and you quite quickly run out of that resource if you don't have things to hand. Overall, the new abilities really are mostly very fun, Ultra Hand issues aside. At first I was worried I was going to miss the old ones from Breath of the Wild, and there was the odd occasion when I did, but over time I realised how versatile the new abilities are, and I started to forget the old ones. You might be asking, if this is a negative review of Tears of the Kingdom, why are you saying you like it? Well, I do like the abilities, mostly. My problem comes with their integration into the game. Let me explain that to you by talking about the game's dungeons. One of the main complaints people had about Breath of the Wild was the lack of traditional Zelda dungeons. The Divine Beasts were the closest approximation we had, although they were short, devoid of significant puzzles or backtracking, and there was no traditional dungeon item that you would expect, like the claws, the hammer, etc. The Divine Beasts were all very similar, without a distinct visual style of their own. From the inside it wasn't really possible to tell which one you were in, and the bosses at the end of each of them were also indistinct, not memorable, only nominally related to the theme of the region. It was obvious that a lot of effort had been put into developing Hyrule, the physics engine and traversal, but not much time had been spent making meaningful dungeons. But given how large Breath of the Wild is, you can't really hold it against them. Tears of the Kingdom was then a chance for them to right that wrong, and at first it seemed like they had succeeded. There's a fire temple, a water temple, a lightning temple, and a wind temple. Plenty of temples and dungeons. The problem is, they come across as a half measure. They feel like a compromise between the detailed linear dungeons of old and the open-ended freeform Divine Beasts. And in making that compromise, something has been lost. I'll start with the positives before moving on to the negatives. Some of the approaches to the dungeons are stunning. The first one I did, and I'm guessing it's the first for most people, as the game heavily pushes you in that direction, was the Wind Temple. The long climb up involves multiple traversal puzzles, combat encounters, and impressive vistas to behold. The moment when you arrive at the top of the storm and the clouds part is truly awe-inspiring and is one of my favourite moments in the game. The dungeons all have their own unique visual style, something that we wanted addressed from Breath of the Wild. They have their own music, and a boss that's appropriately themed for the region of the dungeon. There are some really unique mechanics in some of them. I'm thinking of the floating water bubbles that you can jump into in the water temple, and the rail mechanics of the fire temple, although I'll get onto the issues with that in a minute. And that's about it for the positives. Now let's talk about the negatives. The layout of the dungeons feels simple. The worst offender for this is probably the water temple. I think you can see the whole dungeon from one vantage point. When you go back and look at older Zelda dungeons from any of the games before Breath of the Wild, the map layouts are quite intricate and complex. The dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom are too short. I think I finished the water temple in about half an hour. The puzzles are too simple and mostly involve flipping switches and don't require much lateral thinking. And maybe the biggest issue is that a lot of the mechanics can be completely circumvented. Let's go back to the fire temple. This requires you to reach certain points in the dungeon in order to flip a switch. It's clear the intent was for you to use the train tracks and the various line switches to make your way through and up the dungeon to the top, before moving back down to the last switch on the boss. The problem is Ultra Hand and the complete flexibility it gives you. The fact that you can use it within the dungeon to make a flying machine completely negates any of the challenge, meaning you can just skip all of the puzzles and traversal and go straight to the switches. I don't know what the ultimate solution to this is, but there are a few ideas I had. They could have found a way to turn off Link's ability to craft in dungeons. They could have made the dungeons instances. Something, anything, to preserve the integrity of the dungeon puzzles. You could just say, well, don't use Ultra Hand. But it's something in the game, and it's something available to you at that time. So unless you have a lot of willpower, it's hard not to use it. It's also kind of baked into the puzzles of these dungeons as well, in some ways. So to sum up this section, the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom are definitely an improvement on the Divine Beasts, and a step in the right direction. But they didn't go far enough in my opinion, and they end up straddling the line somewhere between the complex classical dungeons of old and the simple dungeons of Breath of the Wild. Now I'm just going to talk about the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom. I was mostly a fan of the shrines in Breath of the Wild. I didn't have many issues with them. I liked using the motion controls and the abilities that Link had to solve the puzzles. They were a novelty for me, and I still enjoyed finding them late into the game, seeing that shiny light on the horizon. And in Tears of the Kingdom, I think a lot of the shrines are an improvement on this formula, probably because the abilities are an upgrade as well. However, they are still just that, shrines. They're the same content from Breath of the Wild, imported to Tears of the Kingdom, given a slight spin or upgrade, and for all intents and purposes are reused content. Now I have to admit that I haven't done all of the shrines in the game, and so my sample might be a bit skewed, but it seems to me like there are a lot of combat shrines, and a lot of shrines with no puzzle element at all. Maybe that's just me and my sample size is skewed, but I just did not enjoy the combat shrines whatsoever. And obviously the ones that had no puzzles at all are nothing really. I don't have much more to say about the shrines. I think on the whole they are a good thing. However, I don't think they do enough to differentiate Tears of the Kingdom from Breath of the Wild. I think the time the developers spent making so many shrines may have been better spent making something new. Without going into spoiler territory, I'm going to talk about the story of Tears of the Kingdom. The story is an improvement over Breath of the Wild to be sure, but unfortunately that's not saying much. In the first game, you were just given an exposition dump by King Rhoam and then set free. The next piece of story you consume at this point might actually be the game's conclusion, as you are free to go and fight Calamity Ganon if you like. The rest of the story is optional, taking the form of interspersed cutscenes which try to fill in the gaps. I sound overly negative, and I really did enjoy Breath of the Wild, but in my mind these are just facts. It's not like that here. In Tears of the Kingdom, there are the makings of a proper story, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, albeit just not a very coherent one. This is something that everyone has to experience if they play the game. There are a ton of cutscenes, and almost all of them are mandatory. If you want to finish, you need to explore all 4 corners of the map. You need to go underground, you need to explore the Sky Islands. Much more of Tears of the Kingdom isn't optional in this way, and so you would think that it would form more of a coherent narrative throughout. You would think. I have multiple issues with the story. The biggest and most glaring problem for me is that for as cool as he looks, Ganon in this game just isn't as compelling a villain as he is in something like Ocarina of Time or Wind Waker. His motivations aren't explained very well, and he feels two-dimensional. The game on the whole, as a story, does not follow on well from Breath of the Wild. Where are the Divine Beasts? Where are the Guardians? And where's all the Sheikah technology gone? I don't think there's an in-game explanation for any of these things being missing, but if I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. Zelda is still largely an absent figure in this game, and doesn't have much agency. You see the same exact cutscenes for the sages 4 times. I will say that the climax, the last boss battle, and the cutscenes around the end of the game are quite impressive, but I don't think they can make up for all of the glaring issues. I also just struggle to remember a lot of the story now when I'm thinking back, which I really don't think is a good sign. So there we have it. And listen, I'm sorry that this video is mostly negative, and I really did enjoy most of the time with Tears of the Kingdom. It just didn't live up to the lofty heights or the pre-release hype that I thought it would for me. I don't think I'll replay it, and I don't actually think I'll be thinking about it in years to come. I'll just leave you with something that I've been thinking about. I have some friends who aren't big gamers. They don't play every modern release or keep up with the news, but they played Breath of the Wild, each for different amounts of time, but one for 100 hours, one for 200 hours, and one for even 300 hours. They were all excited for Tears of the Kingdom and all picked it up early after it released. But now when I look at their Nintendo Switch profiles, I can see that each of them have collectively put into this game, between the 3 of them, about 20 hours. And I think that's quite telling that something has gone wrong.